The next day, a Sabbath. Today being the Sabbath, the travellers are staying put. Jews don't travel on the seventh day of the week. Those who are in the habit of regular worship descended on the local synagogue, whose leader was more than happy to leave the sermon to the renowned rabbi from Nazareth. Oh, how Mary glowed with pride as her eldest son addressed the packed congregation. Jesus took his theme from the Exodus, when my boss rescued the entire Jewish nation from slavery in Egypt. I was fascinated to study the different pictures which formed in the minds of the people as Jesus talked to them about that awful last night in Egypt, when the first Passover meals were eaten. The picture in Jesus' mind was of the Passover lamb lying helpless in the hands of its owner as its throat was cut and it bled to death. This was the only part of the story he mentioned. However, across the synagogue, every mind imagined a different scene. The older men thought of the Israelites escaping captivity through the parted waters of the Red Sea. The young hotheads pictured the whole Egyptian army drowning as the waters returned to their usual position. Both groups looked at Jesus and saw him as the new Moses. The younger women, meanwhile, were drifting into the fantasy of so many Jewish girls of marrying a man as strong and faithful as Moses. As they did, they considered to themselves that Jesus himself was not yet married and began to plan the reorganization of his house in Capernaum for when they moved in. As for the older women, unless planning their daughter's marriage to Jesus, they were quickly distracted onto lists of all the things they would have to buy before they could cook their own Passover lamb in Jerusalem. In all that packed synagogue, as far as I could see, there was only one person who really grasped the meaning of Jesus' sermon. It was Mary, sitting in the women's section next to an old and crippled lady from a neighbouring village. As Mary looked in her imagination at that pathetic lamb being prepared for its death, she understood that her son's role in this drama would not be as the new Moses. Their eyes met across the synagogue, and in that briefest moment of mother and son communication, Jesus realised that his message was too much for these excited peasants he loved so much. If they were to grasp that God's victory lies in the realm of faith and love rather than in war and politics, he would have to show them. He stopped his sermon there, and when all the eyes in the synagogue were on him, he called to the crippled woman seated beside his mother. Even when sitting down, this lady was clearly bent over forwards. When she stood up, the full measure of her disability became apparent because her back remained at a right angle to her legs. She shuffled forwards painfully, leaning on two crude sticks, her face lined with the pain and sadness of the past 20 years. But her eyes told a different story. They sparkled with the light of a faith that had grown with every agonizing walk from her home to the synagogue to worship the God she had learned to love even more than she loved her late husband. There she stood before Jesus, patient and trusting. Jesus looked down at her and remembered a sermon he'd preached nearly 3 years earlier. How blessed are the poor, for God's kingdom is theirs. He stepped out from behind the reading desk and stooped to take the lady by her hands. "My dear woman," he told her, looking into her encouraging eyes, "you are set free from your disability." He slowly lifted her hands upwards, and as he did, her back straightened. Local villagers and visiting Galileans watched astounded. They'd heard plenty of stories of Jesus healing people, but few, apart from those who'd been cured themselves, had seen it happen. Jesus had been careful to do such things in private, away from idle eyes and gossiping mouths. On this occasion, though, he wanted people to see. He wanted them to gain some understanding of the real purpose of his mission, to put straight the centuries of twisted truths that have been the fruit of the opposition influence on the earth. Just as the congregation were about to break into spontaneous applause at the joy of this wonderful woman dancing for the first time since her youth, the leader of the synagogue silenced them with an angry assault on the elderly widow. "Are there not 6 days in the week for working?" he raged. "Come and get yourself healed then, and not on the Sabbath." A wave of shock froze the faces of the startled congregation. Every mind in the synagogue asked the same question. How could he launch such an attack on such a lovely woman after such a wonderful occurrence? Jesus stood behind the woman, folding his arms around her shoulders. His reply to the synagogue leader was the first airing of his most recent thoughts on how to handle the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem. "You hypocrite," he declared sternly. The congregation held its breath at such strong language. "Do you give your donkey water on the Sabbath day?" Not a word was said. The answer was obvious. Livestock has to be fed every day of the week, Sabbath or not. "Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for many long years, be set free on the Sabbath day?" The leader sat down, red-faced and defeated. Jesus returned to his sermon. Now every ear in the building was listening as he likened the expansion of his Father's kingdom to the steady growth of a tiny mustard seed into a large bush. When the service ended, the villagers swarmed around the diminutive widow Jesus had cured, and the Galileans followed Jesus back to their camp, rather as sheep followed their shepherd over the mountains. The synagogue leader sat alone, humiliated, considering in his mind all the things that he'd heard about the irreverent rabble-rouser from Nazareth. I stayed with him as he picked up the pieces of his shattered pride, and I knew that news of Jesus' activities would soon get to Jerusalem. That afternoon, after a traditional Sabbath lunch of stale bread and leftover vegetables, Jesus found himself in the middle of a large crowd of Galileans, augmented by a few dozen locals. All of them wanted to hear more from the man who could heal a sick woman and silenced a mean-minded rabbi. He spoke to them in stories and images, urging them to commit their lives and their love to his Father, and warning them to avoid being shut out of the kingdom. It was like earlier days on the shore of Galilee, except there was an urgency in Jesus' spirit. At one point in the afternoon, the son of the synagogue ruler, himself one of the Pharisees, a group of Jews who take their religious observance extremely seriously, came to Jesus to warn him that arrest and even death were being planned for him by the Pharisees and the other religious leaders in Jerusalem. "Leave this place," the young man urged, "and go somewhere else." "I must keep going today and tomorrow and the next," Jesus replied, "for surely no prophet can die outside Jerusalem." The mention of death caused a stir in the large crowd, and Jesus' words were whispered outwards to the edge of the gathering. Each person made their own interpretation of what he meant, some that he was bravely defying the authorities, others that he was giving in. Many concluded that he was simply teasing the somber Pharisee. Besides me, Michael shuddered at the possibility that Jesus might be revealing more information than is safe or sensible. My own feelings, still closely linked to those of the son, were melancholy acceptance of a sad truth. Jesus expressed it better than I could have. He stood up and looked towards the Judean mountains that rise sharply from the Jordan Valley towards the setting sun. Then, with his eyes closed, he said, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who killed the prophets and stoned those sent to you, How often have I longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Now look, your house is destroyed." He walked through the crowd and set off on his own. None of his disciples or family attempted to follow him, and neither did I. Nighttime. Shortly after the sun disappeared behind the mountains, marking the end of the Sabbath, a servant girl came into the Galilean camp from the village. She asked where Jesus was and was directed towards the river, where he sat motionless on a large boulder, looking into the patterns of the surface of the water. I followed. She was from the household of the young Pharisee who'd visited Jesus in the afternoon. He wished to invite Jesus to join his family for the celebratory end of the Sabbath meal. Jesus was unsure whether or not to accept the invitation and looked to me for a second opinion. I conferred with Michael and then, communicating spirit to spirit, said that the young man had been genuine in his desire to help Jesus. I was confident it wasn't a trap. There was a deepening vulnerability in my master. Darts of fear frequently flash through his mind, and I feel each one of them in my own being. His face tightens each time he braces himself against imagined enemies. "I will go if you come with me," he said, as he walked towards the grey darkness of the early evening, following the girl. We were both doubly alert to every movement and sound. In the busy streets of the village, we proceeded as if an ambush lay in wait for us around every corner. The girl led us into a large, warmly lit home, furnished with carved wood and deep embroidered cushions. Josephus, the young Pharisee, greeted Jesus with a firm and welcoming handshake and introduced him to his expensively dressed wife and 3 young children. As we entered the main room, all set for a rich man's feast, 4 other men, each identifiable as a Pharisee from their style of dress, stood to greet the visitor. They were all nervous about meeting Jesus. I whispered, "They are more afraid of you than you are of them." Joseph, Nicodemus, Ananias, and Gamaliel were from Jerusalem and had travelled down to try to meet with Jesus before he set foot in the city. Their minds were open to his message, and their fear was not of Jesus himself, but of their colleagues discovering that they'd met with him. For all this, Jesus did not relax. "Secret sympathizers are fragile souls," he informed me. "Don't leave me, Oriel." The food, by all accounts, was excellent, and the children, for the short while before being sent to bed, were a welcome distraction from the intense conversation at the table. Jesus was invited to visit 6-year-old Barnabas' bedroom. He was transformed as he escaped from the studious gaze of the Jewish intellectuals. He threw himself playfully onto Barnabas' cushioned bed. The 2 of them laughed and played together. Then, without warning, Barnabas said, "Daddy says they're going to kill you." Jesus was startled at the boy's straightforwardness. "Yes, they are," he replied. The 2 of them were quiet for a moment, and then Jesus asked, "What do you think I should do about it?" The child sat up and sucked his finger thoughtfully. "I think you should go up to Jerusalem and tell them not to be so silly," he said. "I think I shall," Jesus replied. He prayed with the boy and blessed him before returning to the nervousness of the dinner table. An awkward silence was shattered by a crash as Ananias dropped his wine cup onto the table. There was a scurry of servants trying to mop up the spill while minimizing the embarrassment of the unfortunate guest. Ananias had some kind of physical impediment which caused his body to shake, and in the nervous silence since Jesus' return this had grown worse until he spilt his wine. Jesus posed a question. "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" or not? All 5 Pharisees had been in the synagogue that morning, and they said nothing. Jesus reached out his hand and firmly gripped Ananias' shaking arm. Stillness spread through the man's body like the rising sun warming a frosted garden until his entire being was filled with a warm restfulness he had not known for many years. I watched Ananias' brittle faith respond to the strength of Jesus' love. His face was the last part of him to be affected. It flushed from pale grey to a healthy pink. He smiled. The other guests still did not speak. Jesus did. If one of you has a donkey that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull him out? No reply. Each knew that Ananias had been fully healed. They simply could not reconcile their lifelong commitments to religious tradition with the outrageous simplicity of Jesus. Then he told them a story about a rich man who held a banquet for many guests. But the guests had made excuses and did not come, so the man sent his servants into the streets to bring in the poor and the crippled and the blind instead. I looked into their thoughts as they sucked on sweet juice-laden fruits from the table. They understood that the kingdom which Jesus proclaimed was very different from the one they govern from the council chamber in Jerusalem. But they were afraid to step down from the pedestals of wealth, privilege, and status upon which they stood. The silent struggle was disturbed by the sound of voices entering Josephus' courtyard. Everyone looked nervously around, not least Jesus. He sent me out to see what was happening. I found a small group of richly dressed and rather drunk tax collectors. The bright colours of their imported clothes were a sharp contrast to the black wool worn by the Pharisees. At the head of this merry bunch was Jesus' friend Matthew, who'd spent a rowdy evening telling his former colleagues all about his new life as a follower of the famous teacher from Nazareth. They had decided to come and meet him for themselves, and so had arrived uninvited at the home of one of their most entrenched critics. The man of the house tried hard to keep the irreverent visitors out, lest the entire building become ritually unclean from their presence. It was not long before traditional insults began to fly in both directions. When I informed Jesus that it was Matthew with a few friends, he picked up the wine jug from the table, placed it on a tray with some cups, and carried the tray into the courtyard. In the moment of calm which greeted his arrival, he said, "Let's talk out here. It's a lovely evening." Jesus then suggested to his host, "Bring your guests out to join us so we can all talk together." He looked into the jug and added, "There's plenty here for everyone." They did not come. Jesus delighted Matthew's friends with his stories of a lost sheep whose owner holds a party to celebrate its return, of a young man who leaves home and squanders his father's money on parties only to be welcomed with open arms when he walks home penniless and humiliated. These men who had made their fortunes by overtaxing their fellow countrymen were entranced to learn that although they had earned the hatred of their neighbours, they were still loved and valued by God. For the sake of his other audience listening from behind the dining room curtains, Jesus added to this last story a part about a jealous elder brother who resented the celebrations in honour of his extravagant sibling. "You are always with me," the father told his indignant elder son. "Everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate tonight because your brother was lost, and now he's found." Everyone has now retired to their beds, each with much to think about. Jesus returned to the camp calmer than he had left it, thanks to Matthew and his band of honest, spiritually at least, men.